The sound of a bullet slicing through the air was the first thing she heard. A sharp whiz that could mean life or death, but it wasn't the shot that was the problem, it was the miss. For the snipers, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath as they lay prone in their concealed positions. 3 men, elite, precision-trained killers, had lined up their sights on the target. One, the lead sniper, adjusted his scope, his gloved finger tracing the trigger. A whisper of air through the brush, a twitch of the target's silhouette on the ridge, nothing. No hit. The target shifted, too quick, too erratic, dodging the sharp trajectory of the bullet that had barely skimmed his peripheral. The 3 of them stayed still, waiting for another opportunity. Yet as the minutes ticked by, nothing changed. The enemy target remained a ghost. Each sniper adjusted their position slightly, the leaves rustling quietly as they carefully recalibrated their shots. But no matter how many times they repositioned, no matter how many times they tried, the result was the same: failure. The valley stretched out beneath them, an unforgiving web of rocks and thorny underbrush. It should have been a perfect setup. They were high above, nestled in the trees, their targets exposed. The wind was favorable, the terrain clear. But the day had other plans. The longer the snipers lay still, the more the tension gnawed at their nerves. They were the best, after all. The ones who'd taken down the toughest enemies, who'd killed from impossible distances. They'd handled much worse. This was just another operation, a mere target. And yet, they couldn't land a single shot. Was it the wind? The lighting? The brush shifting in ways it shouldn't have? Or maybe, just maybe, they weren't as sharp as they thought they were. As the hours passed, their frustration only grew. Their eyes flicked between scopes and binoculars, hands clenching around rifle stocks. They had the tools. They had the training. Yet they felt their precision slipping, a nagging feeling like a crack in the armor they hadn't seen before. Every time one of them called a shot, the target ducked or the bullet missed its mark. The snipers, with all their military prowess, were losing to an enemy who wasn't even aware they were there. It was then, during the lull between shots, that Abigail Carter heard the faint murmur of their radio. A moment of clarity, a crackling noise punctuating the otherwise silent air. One of the snipers had begun to swear softly under his breath, frustration leaking into every word. "Damn it," he muttered. "We're missing at this range? What the hell's going on?" The others remained still, like statues, all of them trying to fight through their own rising doubts. But it was a losing battle, one that none of them had anticipated. The snipers weren't used to missing. "Where are you watching from?" Abigail's hand tightened around the radio's receiver as the words echoed in her ear. She was only a few miles away, tucked inside the operations base, but she could already feel the pulse of the mission. She hadn't been a part of the sniping team's original plan. She wasn't supposed to be here at all. But as she peered out across the map and watched the action unfold, the weight of her past experience began to call to her. In the tactical control center, they had misjudged her. No one had thought she would be able to help, let alone intervene. A cook, they called her, one of the civilians who worked behind the scenes, making the meals that fueled the soldiers. She had long since traded in her military fatigues for the apron of a civilian contractor. But the things she had done before, the things she had seen, weren't easily forgotten. Combat had shaped her, battle had shaped her. When they first heard the frustrated voice on the radio, when the sniper's desperation began to color the air, Abigail felt a quiet pull. She knew how it felt to miss. She had missed before, in moments that meant the difference between life and death. But in the silent stillness of the base, with the hours passing and the team struggling, she was struck by a sudden urge to do something, to step forward. Without a second thought, she grabbed the simple rifle left on a shelf in the corner, the one that had never really been meant for sniper work. A hunting rifle, modest in design but comfortable to her hands. It wasn't the sophisticated weaponry that the snipers were using, but Abigail had something they didn't, a mind that could see the entire battlefield at once, even when the enemy didn't show up on a map. The snipers didn't know she was coming, of course. They wouldn't have even known she was in range. They were too lost in their failure to notice someone who wasn't supposed to be part of the mission in the first place. As they recalibrated their scopes again, adjusting angles and positions with the hope that this time would be the one, Abigail slipped into position. She wasn't in a camouflaged hide like the snipers. She didn't have the advanced optics or the perfect shot. But what she did have was a calmness under fire, a quiet confidence that came from years of surviving situations where the odds were not in her favor. With no hesitation, Abigail raised the rifle, her breath slow and measured. The wind, ever fickle, shifted in her favor. She surveyed the targets through the crosshairs, her finger easing down onto the trigger. The moment stretched out like eternity. She wasn't just aiming at one target anymore. Her mind saw three. And then, without a second thought, Abigail squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the reality of what had just happened set in. The targets, spread across the distant landscape, had all fallen. The snipers were in disbelief. They had spent hours trying to make the perfect shot, but she, just a cook, a civilian, had landed 3 hits with a single shot. And just like that, the mission turned. The snipers had failed, but the cook had succeeded. The rifle's echo still reverberated through the dense forest as Abigail lowered it, her fingers deftly working the bolt to chamber another round. She was calm, too calm for the men who'd just watched her accomplish what they couldn't. The snipers, once the pride of the unit, now sat frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. They had seen it happen, but it was impossible to believe. 3 targets down with a single shot from a rifle that barely qualified as military grade. How could she, a civilian cook, do what they couldn't? They blinked at her from their positions on the ridge, still trying to process the moment, their rifles laying idle in the soft underbrush. She didn't look like a sniper, didn't even move like one. She was just a woman who, up until this point, had been standing in the mess hall, preparing the next meal for the men out in the field. But in that split second, she had become something else. She had become the one who saved the mission, the one who turned the tide when everything seemed lost. Abigail didn't have the luxury of celebrating. She didn't even let herself feel the rush of victory, because she knew this moment was fleeting. The snipers would be back on their feet in an instant, their pride stinging, their egos bruised. They'd try to dissect her shot, find an explanation that fit the narrative of their abilities. But she knew better. It wasn't about the shot. It was about something deeper. She glanced at her rifle, now resting gently against her shoulder. Her eyes, though steady, reflected a glimmer of something that no one else could see, something only those who'd faced war understood. It wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about knowing the battlefield inside and out, about understanding how to read the signs when everything else was uncertain. It was about experience, the kind that couldn't be taught in a sniper's course, the kind you could only earn through survival. Behind her, the radio crackled to life again. One of the snipers, now snapping out of his stupor, barked into the comms. "This is Bravo. 3, all targets down. What's next?" But the mission had shifted. In that moment, the snipers had lost their edge. They'd missed, repeatedly. Their training, their meticulous focus, had failed them. They had forgotten something important. The best sniper is the one who sees not just with his scope, but with his mind. And Abigail Carter, who had never once been in the sniper program, understood that instinctively. She had learned to see everything, not just the crosshairs of a scope, but the subtle shifts in terrain, the small signs of movement, the wind's change as it swept through the trees. The team leader, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Davis, finally rose from his prone position and staggered toward her, his boots crunching through the dry leaves. He moved with a careful mix of wariness and reluctant respect. His face was weathered, lined with years of combat. He had witnessed horrors, dodged bullets, and watched comrades die. But this was different. This was a blow to his pride. "You how?" His voice was still rough with disbelief. He couldn't bring himself to admit it, but his tone carried the weight of frustration, of confusion. "That wasn't even a military rifle. How the hell did you do that?" Abigail didn't meet his gaze immediately. She was focused on the fallen targets in the distance, the wind still dancing through the trees, her mind running through calculations that the snipers had failed to make. She didn't care for the question. What mattered now was the mission. What came next? She had taken the shot, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. Turning to face him, her expression as unreadable as ever, she said simply, "It's not about the gear, Sergeant. It's about the shot. You're trying to force it, waiting for the perfect moment. You need to stop thinking like that." He stood still for a moment, processing her words. He had always thought it was about precision, about mastering every variable until the world aligned just right. But here she was, telling him it wasn't that simple. And something inside him shifted. He was an expert in his field, a sniper by trade, yet he was learning something from this woman, something that had eluded him despite all his years of experience. Abigail wasn't waiting for perfection. She had made the shot because she didn't need perfection. She was reading the chaos around her, the imperfections in the wind, the way the enemy moved, and responding in real time. She wasn't trying to force the outcome. She just let it come to her. Davis opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a burst of static from the radio. "Bravo, free, this is command. Acknowledge your position. We need you to move out. There's another high-value target moving east." "Copy that, command," Davis replied, his voice now steady, more professional than before. He glanced at Abigail once more, a new respect in his eyes. "All right, we've got a new objective. You coming with us?" Abigail considered his question. She didn't need to think long. This mission was hers now, too. She had been brought in as a cook, a bystander. But now, in the midst of the operation, she had proven that sometimes the real warriors weren't the ones holding the biggest guns or wearing the most advanced gear. The real warriors were the ones who had been tested, who knew how to think, how to act when everyone else was stuck in their rigid plans. She nodded, her voice as calm as ever. "I'll follow your lead, Sergeant. But remember, this time, it's not about perfect shots, it's about being ready." As she moved out with them, a small part of her wondered if the snipers had learned something about their own limitations. They were trained to take down a target with precision, but they hadn't considered that someone else, someone outside their world, might just see the bigger picture. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a need for recognition. It was simply the understanding that the battlefield didn't care about rank or ego or what uniform you wore. It cared about who was willing to take the shot, even when no one else could. And Abigail Carter? She had already taken that shot. Now, it was time to see if the rest of the team could follow. The air inside the command vehicle was thick with tension as Abigail sat in the back, the hum of the engine drowned out by the quiet buzz of the radio. The snipers sat across from her, silent, still processing the events of the last few hours. There was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Their previous arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility, as though the battlefield had reshuffled the deck and handed them a lesson they hadn't anticipated. Abigail, who had entered this mission as nothing more than a civilian cook, was now an integral part of their operation. They had seen firsthand the kind of warrior she truly was, but their eyes were still adjusting to the idea that someone like her, a woman who had lived her military life out of the spotlight, could turn the tide of a mission with nothing but instinct, clarity, and a simple hunting rifle. As they rolled toward their next target, Abigail couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She wasn't one for attention, and she wasn't looking for recognition. But she knew what had just happened was bigger than her. It wasn't just about the 3 dead targets or the shot that had set everything right. It was about breaking the mold. It was about showing those around her that heroes didn't always fit the profile, that expertise didn't always come with the most obvious badges of honor. Sometimes, it came from the most unexpected places. When they arrived at the new target's location, the team was in full gear, ready for action. Abigail, however, remained in the background, leaning against the vehicle as the snipers got into position. She had earned her place here, but her role was different now. They didn't need her to pull the trigger again, not this time. Her purpose now was to ensure they didn't miss the next opportunity. They had learned to trust her, but more importantly, they had learned to see her for what she truly was, a force of nature, not a civilian contractor. The mission proceeded smoothly from that point on. The snipers, now far more attuned to the dynamics of the battlefield, executed their shots with precision. But in the quiet moments between shots, when their scopes swept across the landscape, they often found themselves thinking back to Abigail. She wasn't just the cook anymore. She was a reminder of what it meant to be truly prepared, not just in terms of gear or training, but in terms of presence, intuition, and grit. She had shown them that a mission could be saved not by perfection, but by someone willing to act when no one else would. The team's respect for Abigail grew, but so did their awareness of how easily things could go wrong, even when you thought you were prepared for anything. As the day wore on, their last target fell, and the operation was deemed a success. But as they made their way back to base, the realization hit. The mission had been successful not because of their sniper rifles, but because of a cook who had seen what they couldn't, who had made the shot when they thought it was beyond their reach. Back at the base, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the team gathered for a debrief. The atmosphere was different now. There was no bravado, no post-mission high, just quiet reflection. And then, Sergeant Davis, still a little unsteady on his feet, turned to Abigail. His voice, when it came, was hesitant but genuine. "You know, you saved our asses today," he said, his eyes no longer filled with the usual arrogance. "I don't know how you did it, but you did it." Abigail nodded, her face a mask of calm. "I just did what needed to be done. No one else could." There was a pause. No one spoke, but it was clear that something had changed. The snipers, who had once looked down on her for her civilian status, now saw her for what she truly was, a legend in her own right. A woman who had been through the fire, had earned her scars, and had never once sought recognition for her efforts. And then, in a small but profound gesture, Davis extended his hand toward her. It wasn't just an apology, it was a recognition of what she had accomplished. A hand offered in mutual respect. Abigail, for her part, didn't hesitate. She shook his hand firmly, her eyes steady, her voice low but filled with quiet wisdom. "Sometimes, the mission isn't about the weapons we carry. It's about how we see the world, how we adapt when things go wrong. If you can do that, then the rest will follow." In the days that followed, the snipers continued their operations, but the lessons Abigail had imparted remained in their minds. They began to think differently about their role in the mission, about what it meant to truly be prepared, about what it meant to be a soldier. As for Abigail, she returned to her quieter role at the base, where her story remained largely untold. But those who had been part of the mission, who had seen what she was capable of, would never forget. She had proved that it wasn't just the uniforms, the gear, or the title that made a soldier. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be seen at first glance. And that, more than anything else, was what Abigail had shown them. That heroes were not always the ones wearing the most decorated uniforms. Sometimes, they were the ones standing quietly in the background, ready to step up when no one else could. They were the ones who didn't need to say much, because their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. In the end, Abigail's legacy was cemented, not in the headlines, but in the silent respect of the men who had once underestimated her. They would carry that lesson with them forever. Always look deeper, and never assume that the person next to you isn't the one who can save the day.